Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. In this part of our series on writing SQL for Excel files, we're going to look at how to update existing data. So the video is all about the update statement in SQL. We're going to start with a simple example and show you how to set the value of a column to have the same value on every row. We're going to talk briefly about how you help the update statement detect data types in Excel. We'll explain how you can deal with columns which don't have headers, and also show you how to set column values using the results of calculations. Towards the end of the video, we'll look at how to update data in one table using values from a separate worksheet using joins, and then show you a workaround to update data in one worksheet using values stored in a separate workbook altogether. So let's get started. The setup for this video is basically the same as for the previous two parts of the series. We have a macro-enabled workbook which allows us to execute an SQL command by clicking on this button. And when we do that, it's going to modify some existing data in a separate Excel file called Movies. I've got both of these files along with one other stored in the same folder, and I'll drop a link in the video description so that you can download these files and follow along with me writing the code if you'd like to. Just to demonstrate the basics of how the code works, when we click on the execute command button, it triggers a subroutine called create SQL command, and the only job of this subroutine is to construct the string which represents the command we'll execute. That's where we'll write our update statements shortly. When we've constructed the command string, we're going to pass that into a separate subroutine called execute SQL command, and this is the one that deals with establishing the connection to the Movies workbook, and then executing the command after setting the command text property of the command object. For the first example, I'd like to assign a value to the rating, review and last updated columns of the film worksheet in the Movies workbook. And to begin with, we'll just assign the same values to every single row. To modify data in an existing column, we can use the update statement. So back in the Visual Basic Editor, we can begin our SQL command text by saying update. Then we need to state the name of the table containing the columns whose values we want to change. So in this case, we'll say film followed by a $sign because we're referencing a worksheet. And I'll assign an alias to that table, although that part's optional, you don't have to do that. I'll then concatenate a continuation character, and to choose which values go into which columns, we use the set clause. So we can then refer to the first column we want to change the value of, so I'll say f.rating, and then simply make it equal to a different value. So I'm going to make it equal to the number 5. To assign values to more columns, we can just write a comma-separated list, a lot like a select list. So then I can say f.review. And because the review column contains text, I'm going to set this to be a string listed in some single quote characters. Let's just say something like not reviewed. Similarly, for assigning values to date columns, we can say f.lastUpdated. And then we could either write in an explicit date value, so we could say equals, and then in some hash symbols we could write in a date. So for instance, 20 July 2021. But what I prefer to do is update this to have the current date and time. So I'm going to use the now function to get that to work. So f.lastUpdated equals now, followed by the open and closed round brackets. Okay, so that's the update statement created. I can execute this code either with the Movies workbook open or closed. It will work in both cases. You'll probably get better performance if you close down the Movies workbook, but just to avoid having to open and close it throughout the video, I'm just going to run my subroutine either from the Run button on the toolbar in the Visual Basic Editor or from the Execute command button on the menu sheet. And it might take a little while for that to happen as I've got the Movies workbook left open, but when I switch back we should be able to see that the rating column now contains the number 5, not reviewed is in the review column, and the current date and time in the last updated column. If you'd like to clear the values in a column, you have to be a little careful with data types. Let's say, for example, I wanted to get rid of the value in the review column. Because all of that is text, a fairly simple thing I could do is set the value of each row to have an empty string. So back in the Visual Basic Editor, just inside the single quotes there where it says not reviewed, I can take away that bit of text, leave the single quotes in place, and then run the subroutine again, and we'll find, once it's finished, if I switch back to the Movies workbook, that all the review values have now disappeared. If I try to do the same thing with the rating column or the last updated column, however, this wouldn't be quite so successful. The rating column contains a list of numbers. If I try to set a number to an empty string and I try to run that subroutine, I'll find that I get a data type mismatch error. If I do want to clear the value of a column regardless of what data type it has, rather than trying to use empty strings, which is a fairly common technique I suppose in VBA, we'd use a null value instead. So I can say set the rating to null, I can set the review to null, and I could set the last updated to null as well. And then if I run that subroutine again, I'll find that once it's finished, again it's probably worthwhile closing down the movies workbook if you're testing this yourself. Once I switch back to movies, the values of all three columns have now been removed completely. If you attempt to assign a value to an empty column, you may find that the data type isn't detected correctly. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor and let's try to assign a number again to the rating column. So let's go back to the number 5. If I execute that subroutine and just wait for it to finish, it might even be quicker to close down the workbook and reopen it, you might find that when you get back to that column, rather than entering the value as a number, Excel detects this as a number formatted as text. I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic Editor and I'll set that back to null and then run that subroutine again. One way you can help with this is to populate the column with the values of the correct data type in the first place, but you might not have to populate every single row. If I just type in a value of 0 for the first row of the rating column and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor and then assign the number 5 and then execute the subroutine again, we may find that when we get back to the movies workbook this time, that one single number in the first row is sufficient to help the code to identify what the data type of that column is. Rather than using a dummy value to help identify data types, you could also simply apply a format to the column that you're about to populate. So let's head to the top of column J, the first value. I'll hold down the Control and Shift keys and tap the down arrow key to highlight that entire column. I can then apply a simple number format to that. So if I pick the standard number format, and then I should probably reduce the number of decimal places a couple of times as well. And then, having done that, if I head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I can set the rating back to null and then execute that subroutine. So eventually, when that's finished, we should find that that column is now empty again, but the data type has been remembered, sorry, the format has been remembered as a number. And then if we head back to the Visual Basic Editor again, populate this with another number, run the subroutine again, we will hopefully see when we get back to the movies workbook that even though the column was initially empty, because of the number format, the value we enter is no longer formatted as text. I've already applied a custom format to the values in column L just to make sure that the date gets formatted with the time component as well. So if we head back to the Visual Basic Editor now, we could change our values for the review column back to not reviewed. And then for the last updated column, we can use the now function again. And if we run that subroutine again, even though the last updated column didn't contain any values, when we head back to the movies workbook, we'll find that it's formatted in the same way as it was according to the custom number format. Next, I'd like to take a quick look at what happens if we try to do similar things in a table with no headers. So there's a separate worksheet there called Film No Headers, which contains all the same base data as the main film worksheet. There's just nothing in columns J, K and L, which will become the rating, review and last updated columns. So to get this to work, let's start by heading back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we'll need to change a few things. Of course, we'll need to update the name of the table we're updating, so that's Film No Headers. We should also tell our connection string not to expect column headers in the table we're connecting to. So if we scroll down into the Execute SQL command subroutine, we'll find that there's an extended property in the connection string section which says HDR equals yes. So let's set that to no. This means, of course, that if we scroll back up, we can't set these column names explicitly by using their names. To refer to a column or a field when there is no column heading, you may remember this from an earlier video in the series, you can write the letter F followed by the number of the column you want to update, so F1 for the first column, for example. I need to know how many columns I'm populating, so there are 9 current columns, so column J will be column F10. So let's say F10 will become number 5, F11 will become not reviewed, and F12 will become the value of the now function. Sadly, however, if I attempt to run this subroutine, it won't work. Because there's no data in those columns, J, K and L, essentially they don't belong to the table at all. So I can't populate a column which doesn't exist. This is where dummy values can come in really handy. If I click on the OK button and head back to the Movies workbook, I'm going to type in a 0 in the first row of column J, any old random bit of text in column K, and then let's just press the keyboard shortcut Control and semicolon to get the date, followed by a space, and then Control and Shift and semicolon to get the time as well, and that will insert a date and time value. It's a fixed value, it won't change, so it's not calculating that value, it's just inserting the current date and time when you press the keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so having done that, if we head back to the Visual Basic Editor now, and we run the subroutine again, we should find it takes a little longer, and when we get back to the Movies workbook, we have indeed populated those 3 columns with the values we've asked for. Next, I'd like to go back to the original film sheet and look at how to update the value of a column using the result of a calculation. So we'll update the profit column by subtracting the budget from the box office, and we'll update the success column to say the words either winner or loser based on the value of the Oscar wins column. Let's make a couple of basic changes first of all. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, I'll change my connection string to say that the HDR extended property is equal to yes, and then back up in the update statement we'll revert to using the original film table or film worksheet. For this example, we're only going to update 2 columns. We could update the named columns with explicit values as well as the calculated columns as well. But for this example, just to tidy things up a little bit, I'm going to get rid of the 3rd column, and then we're going to refer to these columns by name. So we're going to refer to the profit column and then the success column. So for the profit column, this is nice and easy. I just want to subtract the value of the box office, the value of the budget from the box office. So we can take away the number 5 there and replace that by referring to f.boxoffice and then subtract from that f.budget. Possibly the simplest calculation we could create. We've covered expressions and calculations in lots of detail in previous videos in the series, so anything we've done in those previous videos is valid here. Just because the next column is going to be a little longer, it might be worthwhile breaking this line across multiple lines. So let's concatenate another continuation character. And then on the next line, we'll add the comma there and say f.success equals, and then rather than that explicit bit of text, we can use an if function instead. So I'm going to say where if f.Oscar wins equals 0, then put the word loser, otherwise put the word winner. And that really is as difficult as that gets. So let's run that subroutine again, and we should see when it's finally finished, heading back to the Movies workbook has populated the profit and the success columns according to the result of the calculation. So far all of our update statements have affected every row of the table, but we can also add a where clause to affect only certain rows. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to change the value of the rating and the review columns for this next example. So I'm just going to reuse my existing set clause. I'll set f.rating and f.review. For the rating, I'm going to set the value to 0. And for the review, I'm just going to put in a specific word. I'm going to put in the word terrible. But I don't want to do that for every single film. I only want to do this for films that belong to the awful genre. So to limit the rows that this affects, we can add a continuation character and then have a where clause at the end. The where clause here is the same as the where clause we've used in multiple other videos in this series, so all the standard criteria you can write here are available. So I'm going to say where f.genre equals, and then look for the word awful. Okay, so having done that, we can run that subroutine. Shouldn't take too long because there aren't that many awful films in the database. If we then head back to the movies workbook, I suppose the quickest way to find the rows we've just changed is to sort the rating column in ascending order of value. So the 5 terrible films appear at the top of this list with their rating set to 0 and their review set to terrible. Next, I'd like to look at how to update information in the film worksheet based on information stored in the reviews worksheet. And to do that, we're going to join those two sheets together using the value of the film ID columns. Whenever those columns have a matching value, we'll modify the value of the rating and review columns in the film sheet. So hopefully you can remember at least a little bit about how joins work from previous videos in the series. If we head back to the Visual Basic Editor, after we've referred to the film sheet, let's add a new line, and then we'll use an inner join to join the reviews sheet. I'll give that an alias as R, and then on the next line, let's say which columns those two tables are joined on. So I'm going to say on f.filmid equals r.filmid. This is where the column aliases become handy. It means we don't have to write out the complete worksheet name again multiple times. I'll then concatenate another continuation character to get the set statement there. And what we want to do is set the rating column in the film worksheet to be equal to the rating column in the reviews worksheet. So f.rating equals r.rating. And in a similar way, we'll say f.review equals r.review. So, having done that, we can run that subroutine again. And if we switch back to the movies worksheet, we should see an awful lot of new different reviews have appeared in the film sheet, and a lot of different values in the rating column as well. What I'd like to be able to do next is update values in the film worksheet of the movies workbook with information taken from a different workbook altogether. So there's a separate workbook called Reviews. Let me just quickly double click on that to open it up and show you what's in there. It's just another copy of the same Reviews worksheet that's currently sitting in the movies workbook. Now in principle that should be relatively straightforward to join to the film sheet in just the same way we have with the Reviews worksheet which lives in the movies workbook. We can use the in clause, as we have in many different previous videos, to refer to tables in a separate workbook. But sadly this doesn't work quite so well with the update statement. Let me just show you what I mean by that. I'm going to head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and just so I don't have to undo lots of stuff, I'm going to make a copy and a paste of our current SQL command, and then just comment out one of those two. Then, instead of just saying inner join reviews, I'm going to create a subquery here to select everything using the asterisk from reviews. And then at the end of that line, I'll add another continuation character. And then we're going to use the in clause to say which workbook the reviews worksheet belongs to. Now you may remember from previous videos with the in clause, we need to specify two things. The file path that contains that worksheet in one set of single quotes, and then the file type in another set of single quotes. We would then close the round brackets, give that subquery an alias as R, and then everything should work. So to set the file path, I don't want to have to type in the entire thing, so let's close a set of double quotes and concatenate that with the thisworkbook.path property, and then concatenate that with /reviews.xlsx. The file type is fairly straightforward. That's the same file type that we used in the connection string in the other procedure. So I could just cheat and copy and paste XL12.0 XML and the semicolon character there and paste that into the file type property. Now in principle, that's something we've done multiple times in other videos, reference a table or a worksheet in a different workbook using the in clause. However, when it comes to the update statement, if I try to run that one, I get a very detailed, specific error message telling me that this particular feature to update data in a linked Excel spreadsheet has been disabled in this version of Access. So sadly, that isn't an option for us in this particular case. One potential workaround for this situation would be to import the data from the separate reviews workbook into the movies workbook before we then join those tables together. This is going to rely on using the select in to statement that we covered in a lot of detail in the previous video, so I'm not going to go into quite as much detail here, but just to show you the basic general principle. I'm going to head over to the movies workbook first, and then I'm going to get rid of the reviews worksheet that's currently living in there. So I'm going to right click and delete that and confirm that I want to. And then I'm going to also clear the ratings. Let's just make the ratings for all the films 0. I'll just fill down the rating of 0 by double clicking the autofill handle. And then for the review column, I'm just going to get rid of all of the reviews, just so we can prove that we're actually adding the data back into this workbook. Then I'm going to save the movies workbook and close it down entirely. You may remember from the previous video that to use the select in to statement, you need to make sure that the target workbook is closed. Having done that, we can head back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then we're going to adapt this currently active SQL command to select all the data from the review sheet in that workbook into a new worksheet in the movies workbook. So I'll need to make quite a few changes here. Let's get rid of the update statement first of all, and the beginnings of our inner join. So we'll get up to the point where we say select everything, select asterisk. Then I'm just going to close some double quotes there and concatenate a continuation character and take the from clause down to the next line. And then we've got the in clause, which specifies which workbook that worksheet belongs to, so that's all good. I don't need to give this one an alias, so let's get rid of the alias there. And of course I don't need the on clause, I'm not joining it to anything, and I'm not setting the values of any columns, so let's get rid of all of those as well. Okay, the one thing we then need to insert in between there is the into clause. So in a new line, I'm going to say into, and then in some square brackets, write out the name of the new named range I'd like to create. So I'm going to call the named range reviews. If you're not sure why I'm using a range name there rather than a worksheet name, then I'll ask you to refer to the previous video on the select into statement. So I'll concatenate that into the next line from reviews. Okay, so that's the first command that I want to execute to get all of the data into the movies workbook. Oh, I'll also just need to get rid of that extra closed round bracket there as well. Okay, so once I've executed that command, I then want to update the film table by joining the reviews range name to my existing film worksheet. So at this point, let's just move that original select statement, or sorry, that SQL command, and I'll paste this in after I've executed the first command, uncomment that, make sure that I'm not referring to the reviews worksheet any longer. I want to refer to the reviews range name that I'm creating. I've aliased it as R, so that's still going to work there. And then finally, we just need to execute our SQL command again. Okay, so two separate commands to execute. Let's see what happens when we run it. We head up to execute that subroutine. It should run fairly quickly. Now all the files are closed down. If we now head back to the movies workbook and just open that one back up again, we should see that although we deleted the reviews worksheet earlier on, it's now re-imported it. You can see it doesn't have the formatting any longer for the column headers, but that's okay. Most importantly, we've joined that reviews sheet to the film sheet and assigned the correct ratings to all the films based on the value of the film ID column. One thing to bear in mind about the select into statement, which you'll know if you watch the previous video in the series, is that when you create this new range name which refers to the imported data, that must be unique. So if I try to run the same subroutine again, the code is going to fail. If I close down the movies workbook first, head back to the Visual Basic Editor and run that subroutine, it fails because the reviews range name is labelled as a table here already exists. So we have a couple of workarounds for that as well. One way, as we covered in the previous video, would be to make the name of the new range name unique by maybe appending the date and time to the table name or the range name. We then have to make sure that we refer to that same range name in the join in the second SQL command. An alternative would be to make sure that you delete the imported range name or the imported worksheet each time you finished with it. Sadly, there's no convenient way to do that using SQL and SQL commands. There are both delete from statements and drop statements that we could execute using SQL commands, but they don't work in quite the same way when you're connecting to an Excel workbook. And again, we've talked about these ideas in previous videos. The select into video talks about how the delete from and drop statements actually work in Excel. So what I've done just for convenience here is I've added a final subroutine down at the bottom of this module that will clean up the movies workbook and basically get rid of any worksheets apart from the main film and film no headers sheets, as well as any additional range names that have been created in there as well. So if we just run that subroutine first, which you could also have done by the way by clicking on the clean up movies workbook button on the menu sheet, we can now execute our command again to import the reviews worksheet and then update all the existing data in the film sheet by joining the new reviews sheet to it. So the end result is that the movies workbook in the film worksheet contains all of these updated ratings and reviews. So there you go, there's how to use the SQL update statement to modify data in an existing workbook. Hope you found that one useful. Thanks as ever for watching. See you next time.